Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation, Dr. Chai. I am very, very honoured to be speaking at this conference. So I'm talking about what is next in open access publishing. So I will talk about a little bit about what's happening globally with open access, some developments in publishing in general, and what people across the world are doing about those developments. So first of all, I'm sure that you all know open access. I just thought I'd start with a little overview of the differences between the traditional model and open access. I think some people think that they're very, very different, but in fact, it is just the way that the work is paid for and the work is accessed, which is the main difference. But of course, the availability across the world to the content is the major difference between open access and subscription journals. So if an article is published open access, it's freely available to anyone who has a computer and a connection to the internet, and any user can read. And if it's published with a Creative Commons license, they can reuse it for any purpose. And I'll talk a little bit about Creative Commons, but I know that there's going to be more information about that later in another of the talks. So where a subscription journal will be available through only to those people who have paid for access to the content, and the publisher will keep the rights of that content so that they can sell it. With an open access journal, the publisher is paid for the service of publication, and that means that the author will keep the right to the content. And that's the main difference. So the author still has the rights of the content. And that doesn't mean that anyone can then copy it. The same issues of plagiarism and all of those rights are still the same. The author still has the copyright in the content, and people are not then allowed to copy it if that contravenes the copyright law. But what it means is that the work can be shared and can be used and can be exploited in whatever ways people want, which means that researchers can build on the research that other people have done. And I'll use some examples a little bit later of why this is a good thing. Since 2002, in 2012, the number of articles in the Web of Science has doubled, and the open access share of those articles published in fully open access journals is now over 10%. And I think when we look at the 2013 numbers, that number will be going up again as more and more journals become open access and more people are making their content open access. So as you can see, this is a graph of the growth of open access, and this came from an article in BMC Medicine published earlier this year by a couple of authors, Michael Laxo and Bo Christa Bork. And what I wanted to show with this slide is the fact that people mainly think that open access is in biomedicine, but in fact, although biomedicine is very much the biggest part of the publishing, open access publishing, social sciences, arts and humanities has a big share and is growing very fast, earth and environmental sciences, and engineering as well. So there are substantial numbers of articles being published across the subject areas. And what's interesting is that Asia has adopted open access more than the average across the world. So the world average of open access articles, this is taken from the journal citation reports in 2011 and the Web of Science, the world average is just less than 6% of articles in each country being published open access. But as you can see, South Korea is 8%, 7.9%. Interestingly, Malaysia is well at the front with 15%. So, China and South Korea and Taiwan very similar, all around 8%. So there is more enthusiasm for open access journals in Asia than in the rest of the world, which I think is a very interesting statistic. And we can see that in South Korea, from Biomed Central's figures, the number of articles, submissions and publications has been growing very rapidly. So in October 2013, we had twice as many submissions from South Korea as we did in October 2011. And so we are certainly experiencing very great growth from South Korea in our portfolio. And we're very pleased that we're also beginning now to work with South Korean journals, and we started publishing our first society journal from South Korea earlier this year, which we're very, very happy about. So why do people publish open access? Well, a lot of it is about visibility. A lot of it is about getting their work seen. There are many, many articles, many more articles being published around the world than there were 10 years ago. As you could see from the slide I showed first, there's about double the number of articles being published now, or actually more than that. And what that means is it's very hard to get your work seen, and so being able to have unlimited access for everybody is part of the way that you can get your work seen, rather than if it's in a journal and it's somewhere which is only available to a limited number of people. And specifically for people who are not within Europe and the USA, it's very, very, very hard to break into that sort of readership, and so all of the advantages you can get are important. Open access publishing tends to be continuous publication, and this is Biomed Central's model. Not all open access journals do that, but we are not limited by page budgets. We don't have to reject lots of articles just because we can only publish so many issues per month and so many pages per month, which means that we can include all of the articles which are of high quality, which deserve to be published. We don't have to wait when we publish until space becomes available in an issue. And that's not necessarily because it's open access, that's more because it's electronic, and so we don't have the problems with print. But it's also because the way that open access is paid for is by an article processing charge, which is charged at the point of publication. We don't have the same limits on how we can publish because we only have a specific budget per year. We can focus on the increasing visibility of the articles through blogs and blurbs and tweets. For those of you who use social media, I imagine that you could sometimes get frustrated when you see someone refer to an interesting article and then you click on the article and it says there's no access. Well, that doesn't happen if your article is open access. So if you publish your open access article, you can do lots of promotion of it, and anyone who sees that promotion can immediately look at the article, and that helps the visibility of the article. As I said earlier, articles are openly licensed, so they can be reused, and that means that people can build on your research, and more collaborations can happen. And that includes things like text mining of data and literature. And again, with open access, there's no limit on the size, the number of color figures, the videos, the additional files. Quite often, people will say to us, it's cheaper to pay an APC in a Biomed Central journal than to pay the color charges or the page publication charges in one of the big American journals. So, what are the issues around open access that people ask questions about? So researchers are interested in how they can pay, how they can make sure their research is visible, but trust is a very important thing. You will have heard about predatory publishers, and I'll talk a little bit about how you can make sure that the content that and the publishers you're working with are trustworthy. And for societies, because I know that a lot of people here are societies, societies want to know how they can bring their journal to an international audience, how they can improve the impact of their journal. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So first of all, who pays? Well, for the open access business model, there is no subscription revenue. So the traditional model of collecting content together and selling it doesn't happen with open access. There's a little bit of revenue from reprints and from advertising, but the majority of the revenue comes through what's called article processing charges, or APCs, and they are payable on editorial acceptance of the article. So if the article does not get accepted, then there is no payment. So there's no submission charge by most of the open access publishers at the moment. It's very much, if the article is published, it then gets charged. And those APCs are paid out of research grants by research funders, universities, societies, governmental agencies, charities. And in my meetings that I've been having in Seoul over the last couple of days, I've been told by everybody that in Korea, the payment of APCs is not a problem, that research grants, that institutes are very happy to pay the article processing charges for the authors, or the publication fees for the authors. They understand that that's an important thing to be doing. So this is a piece of work that was again done and published earlier this year by two authors, Solomon and Bjork, and it looks at where the publication fees are being paid for in open access publishing. And if you can see, the dark blue bottom is grants or contracts. The second one is national funding or OA policies. The third one is institutional funding, and this is also institutional funding. This is from an open access policy. This one's through other funds from the institution. The small grey one is personal funds, and then the biggest open access publishers, Biomed Central, PLOS, automatically waive the fees for people who cannot pay. So we have policies which say we will not stop people from publishing because they cannot pay. So a significant number of articles are actually free for the authors because they don't have funding. And so it's quite often people call open access publishing author pays publishing. I don't think that's a good title because in fact it's not authors that pay. These numbers are the numbers of authors that pay themselves, and as you can see, the majority of payment come from institutes, from grants, from national funding. And in health sciences, in technology, engineering, mathematics, statistics, and in education, social sciences, and law, the majority, more than 80% of the payments are not by the authors. In some of the other areas where the open access isn't as well known yet, there's a lot of work to be done. So still, authors are paying quite a lot. But at least in this group of journals, and as you could see from my previous slide, that's the vast majority of where open access is being paid. the payments are coming from governments, from institutions, from grants. And that's, this slide is a little bit old. Every time I give a talk, I update this slide, but I didn't update it this time because it's not that long since I gave it. And the numbers go up. And so this might be a month out of date, and these numbers may be a little bit out of date. But as you can see, the numbers of mandates where an institution or a government or a funding body says that what must happen is if that they fund the research, then that research must be available open access. The number of those is increasing very, very substantially over the last, I suppose, 4 or 5 years, and continues to increase. And this map is a map of where open access repositories are around the world. And as you can see, it's very, very widespread and global across the world that people are putting their content into a repository. So I'll just quickly talk a little bit about the governmental mandates, because there are more and more government mandates coming out. The US is in fact not moving that fast, but and there's still a lot of discussion in the US about what they're going to do. But in February, the Office of Science and Technology expanded public access to the results of federally funded research, and they produced this statement saying that citizens deserve easy access to the results of scientific research their taxpayers have paid for. And they mandated that there were plans for federal agencies which had more than $100 million in R&D expenditures should make their federally funded research available to the public within 1 year of publication. Now, there are still many discussions going on in the US and a lot of wrangling backwards and forwards, but again, the Obama administration has been come out and said very substantially that they believe in open access. The UK government has gone a lot further, and as from the 1st of April this year, they say that all research articles which acknowledge Research Council funding must be published in journals which are compliant with their policy on open access, which means that either they must publish in fully open access journals, or they must deposit the final accepted manuscript in a repository within 6 months of publication. Now, again, there's been some discussion about how long that time should be between when they publish and when they deposit it. But again, the UK government is very firmly in favour of open access. The European Commission, again, Horizon 2020, has come out and said, as of 2014, all articles published with funding from Horizon 2020, and that's 87 billion euros, should either immediately be published in gold open access or should be available through an open access repository. The Global Research Council, which is a meeting of many ministers of many countries from around the world talking about scientific research, met in May 2013, came up with an action plan towards open access to publications, and their next meeting will be in May in China. And there are rumours that there will be a number of mandates from a number of governments announced at that meeting in May next year. And again, a lot of substantial support for open access. And this week, so you won't have this slide in your books because it's only just come out, but this week the junior education minister from the Netherlands said that scientific articles written by Dutch researchers must be accessible for everybody to read free of charge from 2016. And it says, if the shift to open access publication does not happen quickly enough, the government will consider implementing it by law. Now again, this is a statement by a minister. There's many discussions to be had in between that and a law being passed. But what I'm trying to say is there's a very big move across the world towards supporting open access to research, and it's becoming much more standard, and it's going to be much more of what people expect in the future. So one of the questions we asked is, how do you make your work visible, and why is open access a good thing? Well, I've just taken an article that was published on the 11th of October this year, so only a month, 5 weeks ago. And again, I have updated this slide to the one that you can see in your book. You can see all of our articles, all of our articles show, we have a button at the side here, and if you press it, you get these accesses to the number of accesses to the article. We also show citations underneath. In the last 30 days, this article has had 69,000 accesses, and since it was published 6 weeks ago, it's had 80,300 accesses, and that was yesterday morning, so there's been another 24 hours since then. And you can see those numbers are somewhat higher than the ones that I printed off a couple of weeks ago when I sent my slides to be put in the book. So what that's saying is that this article was obviously of great interest to many people around the world. It got mentioned in the New York Times, it got mentioned on the BBC. It was about how herbal products, the sorts of non-pharmaceutical herbal products that sold over the counter in the USA, when they did genetic testing on them, they found that they had contaminants, that they didn't have what it was that it said on the product. And so obviously, this article was published on the 11th of October. There was enormous press interest in it, and it has had, as I say, over 80,000 accesses in 6 weeks. And one of the nice things we can do nowadays is this organization, Altmetrics, creates a sort of conglomeration of where it's been seen. So this is called the Altmetrics donut, and if you press on that, you get this page from Altmetrics. And in fact, it has various different tabs that you can look at in terms of where's it been on Twitter, where's it been on Facebook, where's it been in the news. But this I find very interesting, because what this shows is that this article, which was published in a UK-based journal, has had 22% of its readership in the US, 7% in California, and you can look all the way down here to see where the interest has been. But even more interesting, I think, is the bits at the bottom. And again, this is updated from the slide that you've got in your books, but it shows you generally what the way that you can use the Altmetrics donut. Yes, 70% of the interest was from members of the public, 13% was from scientists, 10% was from doctors and other healthcare professionals, and 6% was from science communicators. Now, what that says is you've had 80,000 people have accessed the articles. There's been 395 people tweeting about it. And this is the people, this is the demographics of the people who've been tweeting about it. And what's interesting is that a lot of them are, in fact, people who would not have availability of that content if it was in a journal that was only available through libraries. And so, especially for medical and articles which have a very big social implication, open access is very important. And the one other thing I would show you is that this is a very nice bit here which tells you that the article is in the top 5% of all articles ranked by attention. So it shows you where your article is compared to other articles that have been published. And we have this content, we have this altmetrics donut for all of our articles that we publish in Biomed Central. And what does that mean in practice for someone who is publishing in an open access journal? Well, this is a blog by a researcher who wrote about his experience from publishing in an open access journal. And he says, I received comments through my blog, my Twitter network, where I have 6,000 followers, Facebook, and friend feed. But he enjoyed being able to get online feedback. But what was most surprising is that he got collaborations from people who he didn't know. So he got much more opportunity to work in a different way through making his article open access, through then promoting it through social media, and then being able to collaborate with people he would not have been able to collaborate with before. So he says, from this perspective, publishing in an open access journal can provide enormous opportunities if the communication methods of social media are also used by the authors properly and with strategy. Now, this author is based in Hungary. And so, you know, as a Hungarian author, he probably doesn't have the networks that he might have if he was based in Harvard or based in one of the much bigger, more networked organizations and countries. So I think that's a very nice example, and there are many, many more, but there's a very nice example of how open access helps research. So as many of you here are, in fact, editors of journals, I think you're going to be interested in, well, how can it help my journal? Well, I can give you an example of a subscription journal, which was a local subscription journal, which came to Biomed Central in 2009, and it moved from open access in 2009, from subscription to open access. It's owned by the French Agricultural Institute, INRA, and is 45 years old, so it's not a new journal. And so it was in volume 38, 39 when it came to Biomed Central, and its impact factor had been hovering in the sort of 1.6, 1.7, but had in fact dropped just before it moved to Biomed Central. And since it moved, there has been a startling increase in its impact factor, so that it's now very nearly 3.5, 3.494. So it's doubled. And this is one example. We have a number of other examples in the same way. All of the journals, society journals, which had an impact factor before they came to us, and which are now published open access when they were subscription before, have done a similar thing. Now, we don't have very many of them, so it's not a very statistical study, because it's only in the last 4 or 5 years that societies have felt comfortable enough to start to move from subscription to open access. So we have 5 examples of journals that came to us long enough ago for this to be a worthwhile exercise, because obviously impact factor calculation is based on 2 years of articles, and we need 3 years before the open access effect starts to show. Of the 5 journals that we have that fulfill those criteria, 4 of them are already showing double the impact factor they had when they were subscription. So it's a pretty good statistic. The 5th one is a little bit younger and still needs a little way to go. But the four of them are really doing very well. So the other question that is really important for people at the moment is about trust. You will have heard of predatory publishers. There are some very unscrupulous people who are taking advantage of the open access business model to make money out of researchers by publishing anything submitted to them. And they've been titled predatory publishers by Jeffrey Beall, who publishes a list of suspects on his blog, which is called Scholarly Open Access. And there was a recent article in Science which tested the peer review at a lot of journals by submitting a paper that was a made-up paper, and found that it was accepted by a lot of those journals. We're very pleased to say that Biomed Central had 2 articles submitted, or one to Biomed Central, one to Springer Open, which is our sister brand for those non-biomedical journals, and those we rejected them before they went anywhere near peer review. So our editorial processes knew that this was not a good paper. But a lot of people did accept them, and those were mainly journals which are coming from these predatory publishers. So we need to be able to help researchers tell the difference between what is trustworthy and what isn't trustworthy. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, how do people choose what to trust? And this is very, very, very early results of a project which is still ongoing, which is called Trust and Authority in Scholarly Communications. It's funded by the Sloan Foundation, and it's being carried out by Cyber Research. And they've done a lot of interviews, and they're currently analysing a very, very large-scale web survey. But their key findings are that the trust is based on the reputation of the author, the reputation of the journal, the quality of the peer review, and the reputation of the publisher. So I think one of the key messages that I take from that is that if you've never heard of the publisher, and you've never heard, you don't know what the quality of the peer review is, then maybe it's not a good thing to be trusting the information that comes out of them. And the way that you can do that is there is an organisation now called the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association. And what the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association is a grouping of open access publishers who are trustworthy. And they have very strict criteria for membership. They have a code of conduct, and they have ethical standards. And they, if someone is a member of that organisation, this means that they're a legitimate open access publisher. So 2 of COPE's members, unfortunately, of the 100 and something journals that accepted the spoof publication, 2 journals which were owned by members of 3 journals which were owned by members of OASPA accepted the publication. And OASPA has taken very swift action and has taken 2 of them and has told them that they may no longer be members of OASPA. So they have cancelled their membership. And the 3rd one, which is Sage Publishing, they had a process which meant that they thought that the article would not have been accepted in the end, and so they have been put on a sort of review process to see whether their peer review actually is going to improve, and they will be allowed back in if they can prove that. But so I would recommend that if you want to know whether a publisher is a good publisher, OASPA is a good place to look. As well, it's important that journals should be member of the Committee of Publication Ethics. And I know that there's been workshops from COPE here in Korea. I imagine that there have been some workshops with many of you. But COPE is a very good organisation to make sure that publication peer review standards are being kept up. Here's a little bit more about OASPA, their webpage, and I highly recommend that you go and look at them and find out about what it is that they expect of publishers, because for those of you who publish journals, many of you publish journals, it's worth it to think about your own policies and, are you in fact doing the things that OASPA would expect of a publisher, and if not, maybe it would be a good thing to do that. Similarly, I would go to COPE and do the same thing. This slide isn't in your presentation, but I'd like to let you know that OASPA is running its first Asian conference next year, and Biomed Central is organising that conference on behalf of OASPA. And we're very, very pleased to know that Dr. Troy is on the programme committee for that conference, which is next June, and we do hope that many of you would want to attend that. It's going to cover a lot of the issues of open access scholarly publishing. So the other thing that we can do about trust is to make sure that editors have all of the tools that they need to be able to do their jobs. It's actually a big responsibility being the editor of a scholarly journal. So Springer and Biomed Central provide an awful lot of training for editors. We have web pages on publishing ethics and interactive training courses. COPE, again, also publishes a lot of tools and training for editors, and I highly recommend that you look at these things. In fact, I believe that anyone can get to the Springer pages for editors as well, so if you want to take advantage of some of that training, please do. The other thing that we can use is Authenticate. We can make sure that we catch any plagiarism before anything goes into peer review. So Authenticate is a tool which allows you to put any article through a check which finds out whether it actually is a plagiarized article of something that's already been published. And I highly recommend that you use those tools in your journals. And then we have a blog which is run by a couple of people in the States, which keeps us on our toes, so that they keep an eye on retractions that have been published by any publisher, and they will talk about the practices of those publishers, so they will highlight if there's a problem going on in peer review. There's more and more retractions happening, and so they're keeping us on our toes by making sure that we do something about our practices. There are also new author services. Biomed Central, for example, has a relationship with a company called Edance, but there are many editing companies. Edance provides help for authors in writing their papers in English. So there are a lot of other things that are challenging in scholarly publication at the moment. Lots of changing demographics. China is the second biggest publisher output of research articles in the world, and I think very soon they'll be much higher than anyone else. That means that we need to be able to make sure that we can recognize the authors, we can make sure that the language barriers are overcome, we understand the cultural differences. So one of the challenges of authors in China, we're being told a lot, is that they haven't, in the same way as in other places, been taught how to write a paper. So maybe they will plagiarize because they think they've done the same method as was in this method in this paper they've read, so they cut and paste it. Now that's called plagiarism by all standards, but they didn't know that. So we need to do a lot of training about how journal articles should be prepared, and that's why the author workshops, for example, that Edance do is very good. It's very important that people attribute work correctly. It's very important that people can understand how to deliver their paper to a journal. And the other issues that are happening is that there's problems with the same peer reviewers are getting more and more papers. I was talking to a researcher the other day who's basically getting one paper a week to review. Now, she's got a proper job. She's supposed to be doing her research and teaching, and then she's also having to do an enormous amount of work reviewing papers. So how can we help peer reviewers? There's questions about how to assess quality and how to assess impact, because obviously people use the impact factor, but the impact factor was not ever designed to assess the quality of an individual paper. It was designed to assess the quality of a journal. And so there are better tools now for looking at what is the quality of a particular paper. And then, of course, gaining visibility is a question. So I think I'm almost running out of time, so quickly I will talk quickly about peer review. As I say, peer reviewers are overloaded. We need lots of peer reviewers, and they need to be good peer reviewers, and we need to make sure that they're not having to review the same paper again and again. So one of the things that is being talked about is portable peer review, where journals can share peer review reports so that if an author submits to a very high-level journal, which rejects 90% of its papers, that doesn't mean that the article isn't good. It means that it may not meet the threshold of that journal. And the peer reviewers have done good reports. Now, those peer review reports should be used by the next journal that looks at those papers. So there are lots of discussions about portable peer review and sharing peer reviewers' reports between journals. There are various initiatives in place. The Neuroscience Peer Review Consortium, which includes 40 Medline Index neuroscience journals, are already sharing reports between them. There's new organizations such as Rubric and Peer Review of Science, which has the peer review done separately from the journal. So the author can come to the journal with peer review reports which are already written. And that means that they don't have to go through that process again. And then there are transfers between publishers. So, for example, eLife, the open access journal, which has been set up by Wellcome, Max Planck, and HHMI, they have agreed to transfer peer review reports with their articles to anyone who then submits to Biomed Central or PLOS or EMBO, so that, again, if they've been through that peer review process, they can then make it a much easier ride, and the peer reviewers don't have to do more work. And there are lots of new models of peer review being discussed. I'm not going to talk about these. F1000, open peer review. There are lots of new models being looked at, and peer review is going to change over the next years. And researcher identification. ORCID is a very important development where people can identify themselves using an ORCID number, and then they can distinguish themselves from other people with similar names, and that's going to be a very important thing for the future. You can read about this in more detail in my slides, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that it's very, very important that journals keep up with all these developments, that journals use Authenticate, that journals use ORCID, that journals are members of COPE, that journals are keeping up with developments in peer review. And I would encourage all of you to make sure that you are working with publishers who actually are doing these things. So many regional journals are converting to open access. They're doing it for wider dissemination, visibility, and international reach. They're doing it because they increase the quality and the number of their submissions, because many more funding bodies, as I said earlier, are requiring open access. So we find that when a regional journal comes to us, and we publish now more than 60 journals on behalf of societies and institutions from all around the world, often they've been a local journal, they come to us, they become a much more international journal because they're getting submissions now from all over the world when they were not visible before. Indexing can be improved. Biomed Central, all Biomed Central journals are in PubMed. And all Biomed Central, the majority of Biomed Central journals are in PubMed within a very short time. PubMed's changed their rules recently, so they won't actually take journals into PubMed Central unless they've published 15 articles. So whereas all of our journals used to go in immediately, now it takes until we've got 15 articles before they get into PubMed, but every single Biomed Central journal is in PubMed. We also have 156 of our 258 journals in ISI. We are much the biggest open access publisher in ISI. We're the 9th biggest publisher overall in terms of journals in ISI, which I think for a company which is only 13 years old and where most of our journals are really quite young, I'm very proud of. So finally, my points really are that open access publishing is growing very fast and very globally. Funding for it is being put in place all over the world. Open access publishers can provide visibility and impact, distribution and accessibility, and it's very, very important that you must publish with experienced and trustworthy publishers, because they are the people who can make sure that you can get access to all of the developments within open access and within publishing. So thank you very much for your attention, and I would be very happy to answer any questions either now or in the break. Thank you.